This happened back in the late 1980s. This was before places like Blockbuster Video existed. Instead, there were tons of mom and pop video stores around. I know it might seem weird to say that now, since Blockbuster has also come and gone the way of those same stores too. Kinda makes it seem sometimes like it was a lot longer of a time ago than it really was. I always remember the "Be kind, please rewind" stickers that stores would slap on their videotapes. I don't really think everyone paid attention though. There were plenty of times I would rent out a tape that was not rewound. There was also a time or two when I'd get a tape that was not even the right one I'd rented out. Again, I don't really think the people at these stores really paid the kind of attention to what they were doing that they wanted you to think they were. This one weekend when I was in high school, a buddy of mine and I decided to rent out some movies. It was Friday night, and that was the usual night we would all group up together and have a scary movie marathon, so we rented out a few and spent the evening watching them. When it came to the last movie, I noticed there was something really strange about this particular tape. It didn't have any sort of label on it. What we had rented was supposed to be an anthology horror movie called Dead Time Stories. It was a movie I had seen myself multiple times, but my friends had never seen it. I put the tape in to play, and immediately I could tell it was not Dead Time Stories. Whatever this was, it was obviously something that had been taped on a camcorder. It started out showing a living room couch. It was a good assumption that the camcorder was sitting on a coffee table right in front of it. I told my friend I had no idea what this was. This was definitely not the movie I had ordered. Still though, in the moment, that didn't really matter. Now we were both curious as to what we had actually gotten on this tape. For quite a few moments, nothing in particular happened. Then, there was some guy walking up behind the couch. By the way the camera was sitting, you couldn't see the upper third of his body at first though. It wasn't until he walked around the couch and then finally sat down that we could see his head. Well, we could sort of see. He was wearing some strange greenish-colored monster mask. It was of that particular color that back then you could tell this was a glow-in-the-dark piece. He reached over and turned off the lamp that was on his end table, and the room went dark. You could still sort of see his body a little, but the mask was completely visible. It was glowing quite brightly in the dark. Then, the guy began telling a story. He was telling a story of how he'd always had these problems and weird thoughts while he was growing up. His weird thoughts were just about liking scary things at first, and things happening in the dark. Then, he started to really enjoy killing insects and torturing spiders whenever he saw them. The man on the tape began to tell us how, as he grew older, he became more interested in maybe tormenting some bigger things. He started to go into a little bit of detail that I don't care to explain too deeply. It was all stuff about animals, and I don't really like writing about hurting animals. The man explained all of his crimes in great detail though. And then he said he had an admission to make to everyone. He wanted to get it off his chest, but also didn't want to get arrested for it, and that's why he was wearing this glow-in-the-dark mask. The man began to explain that he really wanted to kill someone. He had thought long and hard about this, and had begun going out on his college campus every night really late at night, trying to pin down a particular person to kill. He said he'd waited and waited, patient enough to find the right person. Now we were both really creeped out by this little film. Honestly, I have to admit that we didn't believe it at first. I mean, it was doubtful someone would actually confess to something like this on a videotape and then leave it at the store. We both assumed it must be a hoax. He talked about this girl he'd seen on campus and started following around, told us how he'd gotten to know her. After taking her out a few times, invited her over to his place. He told us they had hit it off pretty good, but little did she know she was his first intended victim. So, we waited for the guy to tell us more of the story. Instead, he paused for a moment while looking at the camera. Then he whispered, "And that night was tonight." The guy got up and didn't turn any lights on. We could hear the noises of a ripping sound, and then a few thumping sounds followed by a horrid, blood-curdling scream. Then the video ended and went straight to static. There was nothing further on the tape, it seemed. I was very unnerved in the moment. My friend, on the other hand, just thought this was a cheap hoax, meant to try and scare someone. I wanted to call the police, but he managed to talk me out of it. He explained no one would possibly do something that stupid. The only thing the video store would have to do is check out the people who rented Dead Time Stories, and then they'd be able to find the person if it had been a real kidnapping. That made sense to me. I just decided right then and there it had to be fake. I didn't want to really have to give it any more thought, but that doesn't mean I haven't thought about it every now and then over the years since past. Even if that was fake, it's sort of a demented thing to do, isn't it? My family grew up in the rural area around where we lived. My parents weren't rich or anything, but we did have a fairly decent life. This was in the 70s or so things were a lot different than they are nowadays. It was a lot more common back then to see someone driving down a country road with an open beer between their legs. Although I don't live out in the country now, nor have I in quite a long time, I at least like to think that things like that don't happen nearly as often anymore. I learned to drive myself when I was about 12 years old. This was not unusual for me or my family. And it wasn't too strange either for one of us to take the car out and go somewhere. I had a lot of friends my age who chewed tobacco as well. I tried it a few times, but I didn't really care for it. Around this time, I was good friends with a guy named Vance. We had grown up in the same general area up on the ridge. Our houses weren't really that close together, but we rode the same school bus to school. We were friends all the way from kindergarten until sometime in high school. The reason the two of us stopped being friends in high school was due to a girl he had liked for years liking me even more. Although I wasn't really interested in her and would never have dated someone my friend had his eye on, this made him really angry. After a while, he just kind of stopped talking to me. A while further after that, he became very antagonistic to me as well, which was pretty horrible because no one wants to lose a friend in a situation like that. It's not like I made the girl like me or something. When I was 17 years old, I was home by myself on a weekend night. I decided to take one of the old cars and see a different buddy of mine who lived a bit further up the ridge than I did. It was about an hour's drive to his house, since it was a dark dirt road the entire way there. You had to be real careful out on some of these roads. They were right on the sides of hills, and there was not anything like a guardrail to keep you from driving off the side and dying. When I left that friend's house to go home, it was already pretty late. I went outside and could see it was actually a little bit foggy out. It was not ideal to drive this path in that weather, but it just meant I would have to take my time and be more careful when driving. However, it was not too long after I'd begun that I noticed some lights behind me. Another vehicle was now coming my way. The road wasn't really wide enough for more than a car and a half, so this person could not pass me by. Still though, he didn't stop at all. He drove up upon me really fast. In fact, just before he slowed down, I almost thought he was going to slam into me and shove me off the cliff. He had gotten as close as possible to hitting me, then backed off just a bit. When this person was about a car's length behind me, he started to flash his high beams on. Then he sped up just enough to almost slam into me again. Just before he'd hit me though, he slowed down. Now he kept his high beams on, which made it very difficult for me to see the path ahead. I tried to pull my car over just a bit to let this guy pass me by. I was really trying to let him go, assuming that's what he wanted. This guy made no attempt to pass me though. He did the exact same thing, pulled up really close to me, then backed off again. This time he began to honk his horn angrily as well. I began to get very nervous. Every time this guy repeated this pattern, I got even more scared. I tried to speed up now, which I was very hesitant to do. I didn't like driving fast down these roads, even when there was not any fog. That didn't change anything though. When I sped up, he matched me perfectly. He kept getting close as if he was going to hit me off the side before backing off yet again. He did this over and over, while still honking his horn at me. I don't know how long this kept up, but finally we got into the bottom of the hill, so there was no risk of running off the side anymore. We were still in a highly forested area though. Thankfully, by that point, I was not far away from home. I thought I could make it there, and at least I knew my family would be home by then. If this guy followed me all the way home, my brothers would be there to help me kick the crap out of him. No sooner than that thought entered my head, however, the car did its same pattern again. This time though, it did hit me. I reacted by slamming the brakes, which caused my car to spin and skid off the road. The only thing I remember after that was nothing. I woke up in the hospital. 3 months after the accident, my car had slammed right into a big tree. I hadn't been wearing my seatbelt in that moment. The only thing that kept me from flying through the windshield was the big steering wheel that my head and chest had bounced off of. I had some pretty bad head injuries, and I had been out for the entire time. I guess I had opened my eyes after a month, but had not been acting like myself. They told me I was aware, but it was like nobody was there. I don't really remember exactly because it was so many decades ago. I had a violent and sort of feral behavior that required me to be restrained to my bed for a while. Then, suddenly one day, the day I felt like I woke up, I just went back to normal. I never found out exactly who was driving that car that rammed me. However, some other people who knew me in high school later told me that Vance had been bragging that it was him after it happened. Vance's dad worked at the police department, so there was never an investigation to see if he had done it. That, of course, convinced me that he had. I don't live out in the country anymore, but I really hope it's harder these days for crooked people to get away with things like that now. Okay, so the best advice I can give anyone about meeting people over the internet is to always meet them in a neutral place. Try and get a good read on them before you go over there or invite them over to your place, because you never know what might happen if you don't do this. I'm a little bit older now, but I was at dating age back when the internet just started to become a thing. I'd had a real hard time finding anyone to date before that. I have to admit that I used dating sites quite a lot when I was younger, and even got addicted to one as well. I spent a lot of money on these lines. This meant I did meet a lot of people in the city, but nothing really ever worked out long term. There was a saying, people who use the dating lines are just the people who strike out at bars as well. I was too young to go to bars at the time, so I'm not sure that really applied to me though. When the internet came around, things changed quite a lot. It became a lot easier and cheaper to meet people, so that was a pretty cool thing. I'm Canadian, by the way. I don't want to tell you exactly where I lived, but we had some cold and snowy winters in my area. The winter that this story takes place in was particularly cold. We had had a lot of snowstorms, and I spent a lot of time at home by myself in the cold. If you've ever been to an area like this, you'll understand what I mean. For the most part, I always met people at a neutral place, like I said, and I never ran into anyone who was abusive or anything like that because of it. One time, years later though, I made a big and scary mistake. Now, I didn't actually meet this guy at his place for the first time. We met outside my apartment and went to a movie. After that, we sat in his car for a while, and we talked while the snow was falling outside. It was a pretty nice visit, actually. I felt like we had a very pleasant connection because we'd talked for so long. A few days later, I happened to be hanging out online, and that guy, his name being Mark, asked me if I wanted to come over to his place now. And we were still getting lots of snow, so I wasn't particularly keen on driving, but somehow he managed to talk me into it. When I arrived, I could see he had a really nice house. It was pretty big and looked quite old as well, but was still in good condition. I could tell he likely had a lot of money. The house was also far outside of town and down this very lonely, desolate road. Anyway, I parked in his driveway, then walked right up to his door. I knocked on it and he answered and seemed really happy to see me. He brought me in and immediately offered me a drink. I accepted, but as you can probably tell from some previous things I've mentioned, I'm a bit cautious about these things. I followed him close behind and watched him very closely as he made the drink. I've always done this with everyone because I've always been afraid someone would slip something in. We sat down in his really nice living room to watch a movie. I don't really recall what it was. I think mostly because we were talking a lot through all of it. It was mostly him talking though. All of a sudden, I started to hear these weird noises around his house. It sounded like maybe there was another person moving around in the basement or something. I asked him if he had a roommate or something, and he told me no. He told me he did have a cat though, and the cat was probably meandering around in the basement. Throughout the night, he gave me a few more drinks. I went with him each time that he went to get them and made sure. He told me a few times I really didn't have to do that, but I told him I just didn't like to have breaks in the conversation. Really though, like before, I didn't like the idea of someone making my drinks when I couldn't watch them doing it. Each time we'd go back into the living room, I would hear more noises and movements coming out of his basement. At this point, it didn't really sound like it was a cat moving around down there. The sound seemed localized to one specific place, and if I didn't know any better, it sounded like maybe someone or something was struggling down there. I was quite unnerved by what I was hearing. I tried not to think about it too much though. I mean, I did have a tendency for my imagination to often run away from me. But still, this whole thing was so weird that it really started to bother me no matter what I tried. Eventually, at first, I did manage to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I did have quite a history of it after all. Later in the night though, something happened that I didn't expect to hear with my paranoia. I mean, it still gives me chills to even think about it to this day. These noises had continued going on for quite a while, and Mark, who seemed to be brushing them off for the most part, began to look like he was getting very annoyed. Eventually, he got up to excuse himself. He told me he had to go and check on something. Not long after, I could hear Mark yelling from the basement. I don't think he thought I could hear him. He was saying things like, "Shut the fuck up, stop making so much damn noise!" And, "I have someone upstairs trying to enjoy a movie, shut up or else!" He sounded mad and maybe even a little bit crazy. However, the noises started to get louder, and at this point I could hear yelling and screaming, I thought. I was too weirded out at this point. I had my car keys in my pocket, so while he was yelling, I slipped out the front door. The whole night had been so uneasy and uncomfortable, I just couldn't sit around after what I was hearing going on in that basement. I got to my car, started it, and began backing as quickly as I could down the long driveway. About halfway down, I noticed the porch lights to the house come on. I saw Mark come out onto the front porch. Instead of trying to come and explain or yelling after me or anything, he just stood there watching as I drove backward and off the driveway. When I got to the end of it, I turned and drove away as fast as I could. I don't know what was going on in that house, and I didn't want to know either. It was just way too weird for me. Mark also didn't try to contact me at all after that. I guess he probably knew if I left while he was downstairs, I didn't want anything to do with him. I don't know what was really going on that night, but I'm sort of glad that I never had to find out. I was a young and naive youth minister working at my first job at a church. I was very eager to know the kids and their parents. I had made a pretty active program, and we were attracting new kids every day. One day, this single father and a little boy showed up. Okay, pretty normal story. The guy was a big guy, not fat, but like a very large stature. He was also a little bit creepy looking. He was missing some teeth, didn't show much, and it flagged my intuition. The boy was a troublemaker. His first day there, he was already pushing other kids down and mocking them. He was a bully that had some serious issues, it appeared. The dad had a sob story that he'd just left his wife and she was quite abusive. The little boy started to show up to youth events, and so did his dad as well. That was all fairly normal. One day, I'm sitting there in my office alone when I hear something from the copy room. I didn't think anything of it at first because we keep our door locked, and you have to have a key or be buzzed in to get inside. I assumed someone with a key must be around, perhaps another minister. After a few minutes though, I hear a kid's voice, so I step outside into the lobby area to see just what's going on. There are the creepy dad and the boy. They were sifting through the cabinets in the office. I had no idea how they'd even gotten in, so I grabbed my cell phone and went into the lobby with them. I told them I was about to run some errands and I had to arm the office, so the two of them would have to leave. In reality, I was going to take a trip around the building to get rid of them. It's an ethics policy to not be alone with congregates in the building, as a protection not only for them but for the ministerial staff as well. I was going to do anything I had to get them to leave. As we all left, they go out one door and I go out the other. I had my phone ready in my hand in the car when the creepy dad walks over and starts knocking on my car window. I had an older car without power windows at the time, so I reached over and rolled down just a bit. He told me he wanted to know if I'd babysit his kid someday. Said he'd left the kid last week and the kid had peed all over the apartment. He was looking for a babysitter that might be a good influence on him. I told him no, I couldn't do that. I had a lot of other obligations and no room to fit that sort of thing into my schedule. The man began trying to open my door for a few minutes, then trying to shove his fingers in and push the window down, begging me to babysit. I said that I really had to run an errand at that moment. Finally, he left and I drove away. I knew he would be there for a while waiting for me to return, so I went to grab an iced tea and a snack at my favorite fast food joint. I drove back to the church and of course he was still there. I called one of the older people I knew that lived close by, and he agreed to meet me at the church. By the time he arrived, the creepy dad and kid were both gone. The next week, I heard them in the office once again. I still had no idea how they were even getting inside or what they were looking for. This time, he came to tell me he'd DVR'd a special about Jesus and wanted to invite me over to talk about it and eat dinner. Said he would even buy me wine. I told him no. Obviously, that was not something I could do. He then invited the youth group to come over to his apartment and watch the movie together. I suggested if this was so important, we could just watch the movie at church. That was all though. He started to get pretty angry at this point. Around this time, I started to get tons of weird text messages as well. I would get messages from numbers I didn't recognize that said things like, "You looked so pretty today," and "I like that blue shirt." This happened almost every day. Mind you, I was not at the church every day either. I started to put things together when one Sunday morning, I was using my cell phone in front of church for a children's message when it started to ring. It was that number I kept getting messages from. I had never responded to this number, so I just ignored it at first. The person kept on calling though, and I could hear laughing in the back of the church. When I later confronted him, he said it was him who had pranked me, so I knew now the texts were coming from him as well. I also knew he was somehow watching me whenever I was not at church. About a month later, the text messages started to get more and more perverse. I was getting texts from my secret admirer and graphic details about a date he had imagined in his head and was planning for us. I had mentioned the text to my male supervisor a few weeks prior. He suggested I respond that I am not interested. My professor at my seminary, on the other hand, said to completely ignore the messages, which I had been doing. Needless to say, this really pissed off the creepy dad. The messages started getting real aggressive. "If you don't reply, I'll make you regret it." A few weeks later, I was at a summer camp with kids at this point, and a fellow female minister looked at me while I was crying about this. Basically said this guy was a perv, and I needed to do anything I could to get rid of him. At this point, I had a co-minister who was a male call the guy and tell him to stop or I would press charges. The creepy dad then went and complained about me to the church board, saying I was leading him on and I was the one sending him the perverted and graphic texts. He had imagined I was flirting with him while at church, whenever I had talked to him and his kid. In reality, that was just my job. It was at this point the senior minister actually listened to me. He read the messages I had been forwarding from the creepy dad and was shocked to find what was going on. My supervisor didn't believe me at first, saying sexual assault was not possible to happen in church, especially from a congregant to a minister. It was at this point, whenever I did something in the service like pray or preach, that the creepy dad would walk in and stare at me from a window outside until my part was done. Then he would just leave. It was at this point that a congregation member who was friends with all of us put things together and said that he wasn't just sending me messages, but 5 other ladies in the church as well. As things turned out, he had been going around to various churches in the area and preying on single women in the congregation. He used his kid as bait to get sympathy so he could try and have sex with them. It turned into a huge fiasco because the church didn't want to ask him to leave. It was supposed to be open to everyone after all. Still, we had a predator in the congregation, and that made many people feel uncomfortable. He ended up having to move because of his job, but I'm still creeped out by him to this very day.